My name is Shamal. I'm one of the co-founders of Dishum, and I'd like to introduce some amazing ladies on the stage here today. If I start with Anita, she's amazing Radio 4 host. Then she appeared on the Empire podcast, and I've been really enjoying that. Some of you will have read her books. Monika here is going to talk about Homai Vyarawalla. And Monika is a filmmaker, she's curated exhibitions. And then Shalina is a great friend. She's a historian, and she champions untold history. She's an award-winning history teacher. When I was 7, I used to go around India a lot with my grandparents. And we always used to go through stations, the hot and dusty roads and stations. And we used to stop at station kiosks, and I was allowed to buy reading material. And some of you may remember those comics called Chitrakathas. Do you remember those, some of you? And Anita's nodding. And I, in the end, collected all of those. But one of my favorites was the Rani Lakshmi Bai. And she was there on the cover of this comic. And she was feisty is understating it. She was on her horse, and there were cowering British East India Company soldiers below her. And she was fearless and glinting, and like, it was amazing. And I read about that story, and I went back to that comic recently, and I feel like these stories need to be told. That comic, as I looked at it just a week or two ago, I noticed it was written by a woman and illustrated by a woman, and none of the other comics were. And in the 70s, you didn't see history by women, about women, drawn by women. It wasn't a thing. And then we came across a lady called Homai Vyarawalla, and her photography of independence was amazing. I later found out she was able to slip amongst the men. They were unintimidated by her, didn't really think of her as anything. And she took this amazing photography of the events of independence. Then, again, later on, I was listening to the Empire podcast, which Anita hosts with Will Dalrymple, and the story of Sophia Duleep Singh, an incredible character, which we'll hear about tonight. I won't talk about it much, but she was born here, the daughter of Duleep Singh, the granddaughter of the great Ranjit Singh, who was the emperor of the Punjab and had the Kohinoor strapped to his bicep. Really amazing, amazing fellow. And she was a granddaughter, grew up a princess, slightly odd upbringing with leopards in the garden. Victoria's granddaughter, Queen Victoria, became a debutante, and then went back to India, rediscovered her fire, and Awaz Do was her sort of passion, give us a voice, came here, was part of the suffragette movement, and got up everyone's nose, as Anita would say, Churchill's, George V's, and she didn't do what she was told, she did stuff, she discovered herself. And I suppose, for me, why tell these stories? I mean, maybe a few reasons. One is that these are delightful women who seem to not do what they were told. And they took joy in societies that are considerably more patriarchal than ours. And you could argue ours is still pretty patriarchal. But then they did it. I mean, Lakshmi Bai told the British to get lost. She lost her life, of course. Homai Vyarawalla didn't play by the rules, took photographs. Sophia Duleep Singh took great delight in not doing what she was told by anybody. And I think that's something to celebrate. And maybe secondly is that women in history disappear. And I know that, Shalina, this is a big thing for you, is that women fall through the cracks. And I think we need to tell those stories. It's so important to do so. And maybe also that as a South Asian, as somebody who's come from an Indian background, these are stories that I think need to be told. These are our stories. They're also British stories. And as England came to India, India has now come to England. And we need to tell these stories for that reason. But I think that as we share these stories together, I think they're important to talk about and important to bring us all together. And just understanding our past helps us to understand who we are. I'm very conscious that I'm a man introducing 3 women, talking about 3 trailblazers. I also have 3 daughters, and they're still young, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I hope one day as they grow up, they won't necessarily do as they're told. I hope they take inspiration from the 3 ladies here today. I hope they take inspiration from our 3 trailblazers. I'm going to leave you to it and get off the stage. Thank you so much.
So my day job is I'm a history teacher. So for me, when we're thinking about Rani Lakshmi Bai, if you know about Rani Lakshmi Bai, then you're probably picturing her in the way that Shamal just described. In which case, she's on a horse. She's got her the reins of the horse, the reins between her teeth. She's got a baby strapped to her. The horse has got its legs up because it's jumping over some kind of ramparts. And I remember that I had a conversation with some of the Dishum team about a month ago, and we sort of thought, did that really happen? Was that really true? And it's one of those things where when you Google image her, and I Google image her today, most of the pictures are of her like that. So I'm going to start, before I speak about Rani Lakshmi Bai, I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which is, of the 3 women that we're going to talk about, she's the most iconic, but actually we kind of know the least about her. One of the reasons for that is because of the way in which her death happened. The East India Company burnt down her palace. They burnt down her libraries. And so I was thinking on the tube here, actually I was on the Central line feeling very hot, and I was thinking about Rani Lakshmi Bai, and I was thinking, I bet, there were letters, for example, that she wrote to the British government, which I'll talk about shortly. And it made me think, I bet she did, we know she wrote letters, therefore I'm sure she must have written diaries. She must have written her own thoughts down, but it's very likely that the British burnt them. So my disclaimer is, some of the things I'm going to say about Rani Lakshmi Bai, we're not 100% sure are the truth necessarily, but there's enough that we know about her that we can build the story. So, like any good historian, I'm going to start with a little bit of background. So, Anita, feel free to jump in because I'm going to talk about the East India Company. So I'm not sure how much you know about the East India Company, but we're going to go right back. Lots of people don't realise the East India Company was set up under Queen Elizabeth I, actually. We think about the Virgin Queen, and we kind of think about her role, in terms of being a female ruler, etc. But I think it's really interesting that the East India Company was given their charter under her in 1600, and the East India Company were a trading company, right? And when I'm explaining this to my year 8s, I always say, you need to imagine they're a massive company, and I say, tell me a massive company, and they'll say Amazon, always. And I'll say, right, imagine if Amazon had an army, and they all go, what, right? But this is what you have to think about with the East India Company, right? They started just trading across India, but they were also using this money to fund their own private army and navy. They then started using, that money that the money that we're spending on the military to take over land slowly. By the beginning of the 1800s, they've taken over lots and lots of land in that way. They're famous, of course, if you know anything about the East India Company, you probably think of somebody like Clive of India, for example, famous Battle of Plassey, 1757. And, the East India Company are gradually taking over more and more of India, and they're doing that in an incredibly exploitative way. Things come to a head, of course, in 1857, and Anita and I had a conversation about this earlier, actually, about the fact that there's obviously a lot of different people have different names for the events of.
Oh yeah, no, I was saying to you that so we didn't learn about it at school at all, and I think one time that's why I didn't do history as an A level. I did it up to GCSE, and I insisted on doing a story about 1857. And I wrote, and I called it the First War of Independence. And the teacher kept crossing it out in the margin and writing the mutiny. And I kept changing it to, actually, First War of Independence. And I just remember that comment for that essay was, "You are a very tiresome young woman." So that was, which really I should wear as a T-shirt. I think it's now a badge of honour, but there we are, yeah.
The East India Company, everything comes to a head in 1857, and the mutiny spreads. It starts as a mutiny. It then becomes kind of the Great Rebellion and spreads across North India. And people are getting involved in this for different reasons. So the big reason that soldiers first getting involved is there was a rumor that spread that the cartridges that the Indian army were using were being greased with pork fat and cow fat. Now, of course, if you're a Hindu soldier or a Muslim soldier, that is going to be incredibly upsetting to you because that goes against your religion. So those rumors spread, and lots of soldiers started mutinying, understandably, as a result of that. So they start mutinying against the people that are in charge of them, etc. And news starts to spread that there's finally a rebellion that's starting against the East India Company, and this is where Rani Lakshmi Bai comes in. So Rani Lakshmi Bai has a very, very unusual upbringing for her time. And we think, and again, my disclaimer, we think this comes from her father. So she is taught how to read and write, for example, but she's also taught at all manner of sports as well. So she, is essentially very, very good at horse riding. It's said that she's good at steeplechasing even. That she wrestled before breakfast is a quote that I come across quite a lot. So she's pretty formidable, I would say. So I love the fact that clearly her father did not care about, the social norms of that time. And clearly just thought, I'm going to teach my daughter all of these different skills. Like many Brahmin girls of that particular time, she was married off fairly early. And unfortunately, she becomes a widow after about a decade or so, and her husband don't have any children. So this is where the East India Company come into the story again, because the East India Company had introduced a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse. And this policy essentially meant that it was a way that they could annex people's land and take land away from them. So in this scenario, they said, we're going to take Jhansi from the Rani of Jhansi because her husband has died and there's no legitimate heir. So they said, right, we're going to take this land, even though they had actually adopted a son just before this. But the East India Company said, no.
And the person who sort of is responsible for the doctrine of lapse is one of the biggest bastards in history, I think. A man called Lord Dalhousie, who figures very large in the Duleep Singh story as well. You know, the reason that the Kohinoor is here is largely because of that man's ego, because he wanted to have a little token or trinket to drop into the lap of Queen Victoria, basically as a calling card saying, why don't you promote me? I've just given you a really big diamond. Dalhousie comes along and he changes the deal. He doesn't want to work and with Indians and take taxation or take whatever can be produced. He wants to own the land. And that's where things like doctrine of lapse come in, and that's where armies become stronger and rulers are either killed or put in prisons. So that's a whole different chapter in the British Raj comes along with him.
Absolutely, and Lakshmi Bai does a huge amount of, does many things to try to counter this. So she actually sought legal representation as well, which I think is incredible. There are letters that we have, the very few letters that we do have of her were sent to the British. They were found in the British Library about 10 years ago as well. I read as well that she said they paid an Australian lawyer as well, sent people on their behalf to plead her case in Westminster, which is incredible. I think it says so much about her. You know, I think they assumed, well, this young woman, we'll just take her land and it'll be fine. But actually, she did a huge amount to try to get her land back. The British, of course, are taking over lots of parts of North India, and they get closer and closer to Jhansi. And the Rani steps up, essentially. You know, so she, like we've heard, she's a very unconventional queen. She's a warrior queen as well. So she's kind of gone from this kind of widow status to a warrior. And again, she speaks to lots of her advisors who say to her, stay away from here. You know, don't put yourself in the front line at all. But she doesn't listen. She's on horseback. She's training other women as well, which must have been incredibly empowering. I know very few other stories from this sort of time where actually women were being guided in this sort of way, in a military kind of way. The East India Company storm Jhansi eventually, and this is where this iconic scene happens. If you've seen a Bollywood film of Rani of Jhansi, this scene is always in, where, like we say, she's on the horse, she's jumping the ramparts with her son strapped to her, and as Shamal said, she dies in battle, which is just so extraordinary. And what struck me about what Shamal just said is, we have to remember that this story is British history as much as it's Indian history, because the Rani of Jhansi is on her horse being killed by the British, first of all, but second of all, she's defending her land from this company. She's defending her land, defending the right for her son to have access to this land, but also she's defending the right for the women in her community to step outside of their gender roles, etc. as well. I've got a couple of quotes that I keep sort of reading from, allegedly from documents at the time. One of them says, by the British, says, the Indian Mutiny produced but one man, and that man was a woman. Mm-hmm. And I always think about that quote, right? And I always think, was he being sarcastic and salty, as my year 8s would say, because I think it seems like is he sort of mocking her a little bit, or and then again there's another famous quote that I always hear, which is, quote, the rebels lost their bravest and best military leader. So I've been thinking about this, and I think that irrespective of what they actually meant at the time, I do think that it's so fascinating that she was acknowledged at that time, in that moment, as being this brilliant military leader. And yet, I would say that outside of India, really, her story is not particularly well known at all. But she fought on the cusp of this incredibly important time for our country, for this country, because actually, after the Great Rebellion, the First War of Independence, the East India Company is dissolved. And that is when we have, Victoria becomes Empress of India. That is the beginning of the British Raj. That's the beginning of what then becomes a 90-year struggle for independence. And she's there on her horse, at the time when, at the very beginning, I suppose, of the independence struggle in lots of ways. So I know we talk a lot about, we talk a lot at Dishoom about going beyond Gandhi when we think about independence. And if you think about the brilliant independence wall in the King's Cross Dishoom, which now has a picture of Sophia in as well. And, the Rani of Jhansi is there on that wall. As one of the few women, because there aren't that many women's stories that we know, which is why we're having this event in the first place. But I think, her fate was really dictated by the British at every single turn, and that's why her stories are. It's a shared story, and in so many ways, her legacy has really lived on in India, like I've said, but. She's not particularly well known here. I'm so glad that we're having this event today to talk about her because she's just absolutely brilliant, and I think she is a great figure to talk about in schools in particular, because by talking about her, we're having to acknowledge how the British took over India, which was by force, and which was using a private company with an army. And it's an incredibly important part of our shared history, as I always like to say. So we're going to move on to talking about Sophia Duleep Singh with Anita. So my first question is, how did you first come across Sophia's story?
I love this question, and normally people phrase it a little bit differently. They say, how did you find her? And I didn't, she found me. That is the literal truth. So forgive me if you've heard this story before, but it's so extraordinary. It has changed my life so profoundly that I never tire of telling it. So I was on maternity leave with my first kid. And any of you first-time mums will know just what a hysterical and unreasonable time that is in a woman's life. I had made my career in TV and radio, but I just needed this child to be peaceful and for my time to be peaceful. So I turned everything off and unplugged everything. And that just gave me loads of time to read things. So I read everything. Stuff that normally didn't even make it to the doorstep. It would just come through the letterbox and I'd fling it into the recycling. But there was this one magazine, a local magazine, which said, and it had a picture, and it said suffragette selling newspaper outside Hampton Court. And it was a really odd thing. It was a black and white or sepia picture, but there was just something about it that made me stop dead. Because people talk about gaydar, there is a thing called Punjar. If you're Punjabi, you can tell another Punjabi from space. And I could just see there was something wrong. This woman was dressed in all this Edwardian finery, but I knew she was an upney somehow. I just knew it. So I rang up the magazine, because, when you're sleep deprived and slightly mental, you do that kind of thing. And I just said, well, who is this suffragette selling, there's something wrong with this paper? And they said, well, her name is Sophia Duleep Singh. And that just sent me off the edge, and I thought I was hallucinating, because, I'd been a political journalist for 10 years. I'd been a feminist for even longer. I was married to a Singh, literally my son, and I had no idea who this person was. So it just started this obsession that actually went on for 4 years, where I just wanted to know, why is this happening? What is this happening? Why is this woman who's dressed like an Edwardian lady in minks? First of all, she's in minks and she's got a sandwich board which says votes for women. She looks as though she wants to punch somebody, but she's a princess. She's a Punjabi. There was so much cognitive dissonance in this one photograph. And being a journalist, you start looking, I looked in newspapers and archives of newspapers. It's always the first place, because I think the way in which people are perceived by the press at the time can tell you a little bit that is factual, but can tell you so much more about perception and the world that they lived in. And I quickly, 2 piles of different kinds of stories fell out when I scratched. So there was this one pile, which in of itself was extraordinary. So there was this Princess Sophia, who was pretty much the Kardashian of her day, right? All the stuff about she went to this party, that party. She was the most tedious human being, went to the opening of an envelope, as far as I could make out. No party happened without her. That was this first impression that I got. She was incredibly fashionable. There were all these articles about, this season she's wearing emeralds, so everyone's going to wear emeralds. I thought, oh God, I cannot bear this woman. Who is this woman? And then there was this second pile, where she was the traitor's daughter. She was the ungrateful immigrant. She was the Hampton Court harridan. She was the Witch of West London, and that was all of her suffragette stuff. So that was the 4-year obsession, really, was just trying to make sense of, it's like, how can all these things be true about this woman, and how is it nobody has written a book about it?
So I'd love to know more about the second part. I think what always strikes me about Sophia's story is that she was present in and was linked to so many what I'd like to call classic suffragette moments and things like that, and yet her story somehow has been lost a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about actually, I think what's interesting first of all is that she chose to be a suffragette and not a suffragist. If we're going back to Year 9 history, then women at the time had a choice not to be a suffragette. You could join an anti-suffragette movement as well.
Lots of women did.
There were lots of women did. There were lots of women in the anti-suffragette movement, which is baffling. But there, you could choose. Essentially, your choice was you could either join the NUWSS, who were the suffragists led by Millicent Fawcett, and they were about peaceful methods only, or you could join the WSPU, led by the Pankhursts, of course, and they were the militant suffragettes. So I'm really interested in, why do you think Sophia joined the WSPU?
Her father, Maharaja Duleep Singh, was a boy king. He was brought to the throne because all of his brothers had basically killed and murdered each other. And he's the last boy standing. He comes to the throne as an infant. His mother, who I think, you're talking about the Rani of Jhansi and the way the British East India Company responded to strong women. What they did to that woman is unconscionable. So you're talking about the desexualization of the Maharani of Jhansi, the Rani of Jhansi, to call her the finest man they'd ever faced. With Duleep Singh's mother, Sophia's grandmother, they basically made her a whore. That was the only way they could deal with a very strong woman who, when her son became the Maharaja, she decides that she's not going to remain in the Zanana anymore. She's going to sit in the Lahore Darbar, surrounded by all these Sikhs who are, sort of testicular and muscular and, all very strong. But she's not going to let them turn her child into a puppet. And as a result, she becomes one of the deepest threats to them, and then to the British, who are eyeing up the Punjab at the time. 1876, she is born into privilege as pointless Kardashian that I was telling you about, who does lots of doggy things and horsey things and riding a bicycle things. But she's not allowed to go to India because of this memory they have of people like Jindal and the kind of upset that this name Duleep Singh can cause in the Punjab, in the north, where there are military fighting men. They call the Punjab the sword hand of India. So they stopped them going. There's going to be this big celebration called the Delhi Darbar to celebrate the crowning of, after Queen Victoria dies, Edward VII. And it's going to be the biggest party on earth. And of course, Sophia / Kardashian is desperate to go. It's a party. Oh my God, it's a party and I can't go to this party. So she starts getting a bit sort of beside herself. Her 2 sisters also think it's very rude. All their friends in London are going, but they're not invited, and they're princesses of India. So they finally write to the Secretary of State saying, can we go? We'd really like to go, can we go? And the Secretary of State, after ignoring them for ages, and they're all having internal conversations, by the way, at the same time, saying we can't afford to let them go because we don't know what it's going to do to the Indians if they see them. But they're only girls, so it might be okay. These conversations are going on. They end up going anyway. On 3 different ships, they turn up to India. And Sophia goes to India as this rather, as they used to call me in my day, have you ever heard the term BBCD? That's what they used to call me when I was little. Do you know what that is? You know what that is. British-born confused desi, right? That we didn't know who we were or what we were. And that's what she sort of is when she goes to India the first time. She speaks English. She doesn't speak her own languages. She thinks Queen Victoria is marvelous and all her friends are marvelous. And she meets all of these people who look like her. For the first time, she's not the ethnic minority. They're the same colour skin. And for the first time, she's treated with racism. Here, she's a big deal. She's like only one. She's a celebrity. They treat her really nicely. When she's in India, she's just another native. So she faces racism for the first time. She sees with her own eyes what's been taken from her family and from her father for the first time. So she understands his pain for the first time. But she also sees all of these people who sort of throw themselves at her feet. And she can't understand it. All of these computations are going on in her head, but she still doesn't quite understand. But she's sort of waking up to all of these injustices, and the victims of famine are being turned into postcards that Brits are sending to each other for amusement. And suddenly, everything she thought was good and lovely and beautiful and enough is not enough. And then more than that, these two huge nationalists in India, a man called Lala Lajpat Rai and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Now, if you don't know their names, Lajpat Rai was a more militant, like you were saying, two wings of the suffragettes, a more militant nationalist. And at this time, they don't want the Brits to leave. They want representation. You know that phrase, no taxation without representation. They just think that Indians should have some say in the way their country is run. And Lajpat Rai is a firebrand. He's gonna push hard. Gopal Krishna Gokhale is like the less militant wing of the suffragettes. He wants to reason his way into some kind of sane agreement. Gopal Krishna Gokhale, if you don't know his name, you will know his most important import to India. It was a man called Gandhi. So it is Gokhale who writes to Gandhi in South Africa saying, we need your help because otherwise this place is going to blow up. We need you to come and fight the British, but do it peacefully. So these two nationalists come and visit Sophia, and they blow her mind because they say to her, you are so important. You are so important to us, and you're so important to India. So she goes back on a ship, and while she's on the ship, there's these men who she respects so much. She finds out that one of them has been almost put into a coma through a British lathi charge, Lajpat Rai. And on this trip back, she writes furiously, we do have her writing, "Oh, you wicked English, you are now my sworn enemies." And when she gets to England, she's bubbling with this anger and this resentment, which for most people can turn into hatred. But for her, it morphs into something so much more interesting. It's action for those who have no power. And she hears the same cries. You know, you sort of, mentioned the line. In India, the nationalists were saying, "Awaz do, awaz do, awaz do, give us a voice, give us a voice." And in Britain, that same cry was coming from women who were every bit as powerless here as the native Indians were in India. And that's why she signs over. This is a really long answer to a question, and I'm sorry, I can't help myself. But that is why she chooses the more militant wing, because the more militant man who she adored, this father figure, is the one who's sort of critically ill. And she's heard these cries now, and they mean something to her.
And can you tell us what's your favourite kind of suffragette action of hers?
Oh God, there's so much. Right, okay. So again, I'm gonna give you a rattle through some of the things that I love, and then I'll tell you one in a bit more detail. So she refused to pay her taxes, which you could get sent to prison for. She defaced the census, which you could get sent to prison for. 1911, the Brits, very proud of their bureaucracy. And she defaced hers and waited to be arrested. And she wrote across her census paper, "As women do not count, I refuse to be counted. I have a conscientious objection to this census." So she, graffiti. She started going to court to support the most militant suffragettes. So right now, you've got the Just Stop Oil people are in the news again for disrupting Wimbledon, and the suffragettes were doing much, much more than that. They were smashing windows all up and down Oxford Street. They were setting fire to trains, and they were pouring potassium permanganate into letterboxes and cutting telegraph wires and setting fire to Lloyd George's house. A lot of suffragettes at that point distanced themselves from such militancy. She doubled down. She started paying people's fines. She turned up to court every day. The Daily Mail frothed with excitement, and she was in the newspaper always being sort of depicted as this devil woman, to the point where King George V wanted to throw her out of her Grace and Favour house at Hampton Court, saying, can we just not, so something that cannot be done. My two favourite things, okay, so those are just some of the things. So my favourite thing is Black Friday, which is, I think, one of the most shameful episodes in British democracy. So this is 1910, November 1910, and the women have come as close as they have ever got to getting the vote. But Asquith, who's the Prime Minister, has decided he's going to kill the bill. He's not going to leave it enough time to pass through Parliament. And Emmeline Pankhurst has got this idea that this is going to happen. So 2 days before, she has a meeting at the Royal Albert Hall. And she says, you know what, if he suffocates this bill, we are going to march on Parliament. We're going to hammer the door, as is our right, and make the Prime Minister explain this to us. Who is with me? And the roof comes off the Albert Hall. I am with you, I am with you. And one of the chief people is this 5'1.5". I'm 5'2", and she's smaller than me. Teeny woman, brown woman, Princess Sophia Duleep Singh, who by now is like a secret weapon to the suffragettes. She's Queen Victoria's goddaughter. She's a Maharaja's daughter. She is this sort of, magazine princess, and she's on their side. And they get to St. Stephen's Gate, and they are immediately, they think everything's fine because they are allowed to pass, but immediately they get to the gate, they're kettled, and this line of police sort of hems them in. And they are forced to watch over the next 3 hours as all of these detachments of women who are arriving minutes, as agreed, are beaten, battered with batons, horse-charged, sexually assaulted by police. It's mandated sexual assault that takes place that day. Some of the worst experiences of my journalistic life, going through boxes and boxes of testimony of what happened to these women, state-sponsored by your own country and your own police, because you're asking for the vote. And that's what the police are doing. They've been told not to make arrests. They've been told to tire out these women, because the Home Secretary, whose name I don't know if I mentioned, Winston Churchill, has said he doesn't want the courts to be all bunged up with annoying women making their case in the courts and slowing everything down. So the police have responded by, okay, well, we will use maximum force. And that's what they're doing. They're throwing them against walls, they're throwing them down steps, and they're smashing them against the pavement. So Sophia sees this, and she's so tiny that she manages to duck through the kettle in a way that Emmeline and the others can't. They're just screaming, arrest them, and nobody's listening. And she runs into this crowd where this police officer is yet again picking up this woman and is about to throw her on the ground, and she body checks him. Like this teeny tiny flea body checking a great sort of warthog. And he just is holding this woman, and this tiny brown screaming woman pops up. And he knows who she is because she's the one in the magazines. But he drops the suffragette to the ground and tries to disappear into the crowds. But she is not having it, okay? Most of us would chalk that up to a win. She is not having it. She follows him. And then, as now, police officers have to wear their identifying marks on their collars. And sometimes in riots when they're going to behave badly, they're covered up. So she can't see his number. So she follows him into the crowd. She's getting battered. She's getting thrown about. But she won't stop screaming, what's your number? What's your number? It's only when she sees the number, V700, that she melts back. She is one of almost 500 people arrested that day. Not one of them will be charged. They're all released. So most of them just go home. That's the end of it. It's a win. They weren't charged. They're not in court, but they've made a huge spectacle on the newspapers. Most importantly, the Mirror is running a front page because it's seen the violence and it's taken pictures of the violence, and it changes everything for the suffragettes. But Sophia won't leave it because she wants V700's badge. So she writes to the police station, she doesn't get a good answer. She writes to the head of the Metropolitan Police, she doesn't get an answer. She writes to the departments above that and the Home Office, and then finally, I found this one document, which is like my great pride and joy. And it's all this long list of people getting very annoyed. Oh my God, she won't stop writing. Can someone make her bloody stop writing, make her go away? And there's suddenly this one really deep pencil mark saying, send no more reply to her, WSC, in his own hand. Winston Spencer Churchill. So, that to me was pretty amazing.
I actually just had a thought, which is, imagine if Rani Lakshmi Bai and Sophia met. How incredibly well they would get on.
Yeah.
Actually.
Wow.
Yeah. And actually, and in fact, if they were to meet Homai as well. So our final trailblazer of the evening is Homai Vyarawalla. I first came across Homai's photographs at the King's Cross Dishoom. And I would really encourage you. It's on a wall next to the brilliant Simon Commission graffiti. And I remember looking at the captions that you guys have put on there and thinking, I knew some of these photographs, but had no idea that they'd been taken by a woman. And so now I make sure that when I use her photographs in my lesson, I tell the students, that these were taken by Homai. So I'm so thrilled that we've got Monika here, because very recently I was looking up some things about Homai, and I found a documentary, and I started watching it, and I was blown away by the fact that I wasn't expecting Homai to be in the documentary. And that documentary was made by Monika, so we're incredibly lucky to have her here with us today. So my first question, which I'm so glad you didn't tell me the answer to this earlier when we spoke, which is, how did you come across Homai's story?
How I met Homai came out of a project I was doing for about 18 months for the Festival of Women Photographers. I'm a photographer filmmaker, and I'd worked within the curatorial promotion of the work of women photographers. I had the most horrific 18 months of fighting for a voice other than a European one in photography. But it was a difficult fight because we were already dealing with gender as an issue. Once you take on the gender battle, then once you start to introduce race into the gender battle, you've started to create an unnecessary controversy and a division. That wasn't what the project. So I was in charge of over 400 exhibitions and got more and more frustrated with the fact that every time we talked about a woman of color in photography, it stopped in the 50s. You know, you kept thinking, well, surely not, you know. And also for us as black photographers, we kept on getting even less than the 50s. You know, we just went probably as far as Windrush would be regarded as historical. And then, so I was frustrated and decided I'd already been working with Indian photographers over the years, and I'd also been to India many times up to then. So I thought, do you know what, I'm going to go to India and just chill. You know, this is this is it. I just need a break because I was in this kind of maelstrom of work I wasn't happy with. I got to India, and long story short, I had dinner with a friend who's a historian and an archivist. And he was just talking, and he was saying, what were you up to, Dora? And I said, you know, I've just come out of Signals, and it's the most frustrating time I'm having with trying to identify photographers that were black and brown and was, you know, historically, you know, irrelevant. And he sort of said, you know what, I'm in the archives, and I've found a dusty box of this woman called Homai Vyarawalla. And as he was telling me more, I was at this dinner, said, tell me more, and I was fired up from Signals. And I said, tell me more about what's going on. And then he told me, and I said, I must meet her, we have to meet her. He said, she lives in Baroda, and we're in Delhi. And I said, well, we have to go to Baroda. So we worked it out, and we went to Baroda, and she knew we were coming. We got messages through, and she's not on the phone. And so we got through to another friend who'd beetle on round to her house to say, these British photographers who want to meet you, is that okay? And it was fine. So we got to Baroda, and we just hit it off. As soon as we started to talk, and we were both kind of female photographers in an environment that was still challenging, and she just said, you have to stay. So we sent Shatish Sharma, who was a historian and a friend of mine, we sent him back to Delhi, and I stayed in Baroda. And I spent 2 weeks of just talking and eating and cooking and laughing and crying, which was a real surprise, because as we talked, we got closer and we got into the emotional stuff. And then I said, look, I have to get back to England if I'm going to make a film, because I have to write a proposal. And I got back, wrote the proposal, and less than 3 weeks I was back in India. And then we started the whole process of making the film. Whilst we were shooting the film, in India, it's a difficult environment for filmmakers because everything comes from Bombay. So you have to sort of go to Bombay to get back to Baroda, and you all know much better than me how India works. And when I had to get my crew together, but it had to be all men. So, you know, I'm the only woman, and the subject of the film is another woman. But she was so honored and deified by then in terms of they were blown out as a film crew. They had never heard of her. And these were hard-nosed Punjabi men who's been working in the industry for a long time, and they didn't know of her. But suddenly they were like putty. They were kind of honoring her and at the cost of wanting me out of the way because she's our mother. Who are you? She's an Indian woman, I think. And Vyarawalla was just so supportive. She saw what was going on and she stopped it. She just cut straight to me because they would speak in Punjabi over me, and Vyarawalla would just speak in Hindi. And then she actually helped. This is where we bonded so well because she recognized straight away that as a woman working in a man's environment, and therefore she supported it, and she made them know in the room that I didn't care what you say, this is what I'm going to be doing from now on, and they just had to bow to her, and she commanded that.
That's incredible. Can you tell us a little bit about how she got into photography? Because obviously it was quite unusual at that, at that particular time for women to be, to have a camera, to be behind the camera. And in the Dashumkin's Cross, there's a brilliant photograph of her in a white sari, and you can't see her face because she's holding the camera. Oh, in fact, it's the picture that's there. And it's an incredible photograph. So could you tell us a little bit about how she got into photography?
Yes, I can, because Vyarawalla was very, very fortunate in the sense that for her age and her time, that she had really modern progressive parents. And the reason for that was because her parents were in the theatre, and her father's in the theatre, and her mother's in the theatre. And her father, she was, in terms of a modern woman in today's parlance, is that her father would play female roles in Indian theatre because that was the standard, because women were in theatre, so men had to dress up. So if you know your father can dress up as a woman, you're going to be pretty open and progressive in your thinking. She started in photography not from the theatre, but from her husband, because she's an art school graduate. So although the Vyarawalla, which is her married name, as a child, she wasn't affluent and she wasn't, sort of spoiled and indulged. What it was because they had an open mind to the way she was brought up, that they didn't actually feel that they needed to follow any strict mode of practice, although they never broke the rules because they were passes. So Vyarawalla wasn't a free spirit in that sense. She was just that she had modern parents. So they still, like for instance, one of the stories about her in the sari, even at school, she went to an English medium school, so a lot of the girls were wearing Western clothes. Vyarawalla had to wear a sari because her mother said she had to wear a veil. So although they were modern, they still followed the rules. So she didn't break the rules, she just knew how to make the rules work for her. So what she did was, once she'd left, and again, coming back to her openness, she was in art school and she was in the sculpture room taking photographs of male models. And the male models were just wearing a dhoti, and it's for a young woman, and that was part of because she had artistic parents. So it's sort of that freedom that you get from that, but still they were traditional parents. So when she started her photography, her husband and her worked as a team. And again, how modern and forward-thinking and progressive it was. He was the lead on the whole photographic duo, but he allowed her, or she allowed him, to use her photographs with his name at the bottom, because you couldn't get published as a woman. So she would just be happy to have his name. And that went on for a bit until she took over because she was better at it. Because he was better because photography is a laborious process. So he was better in the dark room with the chemicals and the mixing and that, and she was better in getting the image. So she went off and did the image and left him in the dark room. And by being in the dark room, when their son came along, he was the housebound father looking after the child, and she was the working mother. So in terms of modernity, she'd switched. She was going out and hunting down different assignments, and he was at home. And she tells me in the film that she taught her son to cook, to clean, to wash, to do, and for a modern, and her son looked after himself while both his parents were working.
For those that maybe don't know of her photographs. Could you tell us some of the sort of most famous people and places that she photographed? But I would also, of course, like to know what your favourite photograph of hers is as well.
Now, again, India, as you were talking about, the whole prior to partition and the birth of modern India, she was at the forefront of it all. I mean, she was watching the entire world come to India, and she was there. So she had the privilege of meeting not just the good and the greats, but she also met entertainers, not just the politicos. So she would, she had the Kennedys, she had the first Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip's visit, the first one. She was there. She was there for before Gandhi's death, but she was also there for the Russians, when the Russians were coming through. She'd watched the young Dalai Lama arrive over the hills. So, you can't think of a moment in history at that time when she wasn't there.
Yeah.
Which is your favourite?
My favourite out of all of her image, and it's because it feeds into a kind of feminist discourse. The second in command after Nehru was Mr. Shasti, and he arrived in a body bag from Russia, poisoned. Well, they thought he was poisoned. It's controversial. It's not recorded as poison, but the whole of India said he was killed in Russia. And they sent the body bag. And all the photographers were dispatched to take photographs, of course, on the train. So they all had, there was a whole sort of, fest of photographers going down on the train to get to see Mr. Shasti come back in a body bag. And Vyarawalla's image of that moment is not about the death of Shasti, but the wife. And it makes me really sad because, Vyarawalla said she just stood there and watched her break her bracelets. Oh, I still get choked up. And when Vyarawalla was telling me, we were both crying. And she definitely had a feminist eye. She wasn't after the guts and gore. She really wanted, to just capture the moment his wife saw the dead man and her love, and the bangles just cracking them in front of the camera. And so the image I like is that one.
There is a really weird thing, though, with great women, and I've noticed it, and I would really hope that we're in a different era where you great women out there won't make the same mistakes. So really great women I've come across have never, ever blown their own bugles. And they've actually done the opposite. So Sophia, who did all of these amazing things and is part of the reason that British women have the vote, never, ever, ever thought she deserved any credit for it, or never expected it. So, there's a book, The Who's Who, where if you ask people, Lord Fanar of blah, blah, you ask them for an entry, it goes on for pages and pages about all of their very, very boring interests and who was their uncle and when they first wore breeches. When she was asked for her entry, she just gave one line. She said, I'm only giving you one line and it's going to be under interests. And she said, the advancement of women. That was her entry. Mm-hmm. That's lovely. That is lovely, but bloody hell, Sophia. I mean, that's why it takes years and years to excavate. I mean, you were talking about, Homai not wanting, or her husband having to put his name on it. Another suffragette who I absolutely love, who was part of that Black Friday March, part of that group, was a woman called Hertha Ayrton. She was the first woman in the Institute of Electrical Engineers. And she was also known as Curie's Rottweiler. Because Marie Curie herself, the bloody Nobel Prize winner, and the person who first found radium, when the newspapers wrote about her Nobel Prize winning find, they said Pierre Curie has discovered radium. And it was only because Hertha Ayrton, this really extraordinary, again, another small woman, I seem to really favour small women, I don't know why, but she's sort of small with this crazy sort of curly hair and these very, very intense green eyes. She would write to the papers and just get on the nerves of the editors until they corrected it. And when someone said, my God, you've got enough to do, why are you doing this? She goes, because a lie about a woman has more lives than a cat.
Yeah, but in fairness, the
You know,
poor Vyarawalla, Mr. Vyarawalla, Manisha Vyarawalla, he was supportive of her, and the reason why she had to put her name was practical. It was just she would not be printed. Even in the UK, you would not be printed at certain magazine if you had. That's why you change your name to a masculine name, and for her. She has always acknowledged that she could never have done this without her husband.
Sure.
She could not have done it because not only did he give her the leeway and the confidence and the support to do it, because he was the one teaching her to do a lot of the darkroom work more so than she's a photographer, so she has the eye for photo, but not necessarily the processing of her work. And it was her husband who taught her lots of things to do with it. And Vyarawalla as a woman, because she had a mother and a father who, again, encouraged her and supported her, when I met her, and I met her at 82, and she was still driving her own car. And she used to say to me, let's go shopping down to get some food. And I kept thinking, yes. So, and not only why I was so in love with her was in her house, she had no servants, no helper. She cooked, she cleaned, she fixed everything. 82, she was doing all of this completely on her own. She wanted to actually, and she wasn't actually trying to, down with patriarchy, I need to be, She was very much like, this is what I need to do. I need, practical. She never for one moment thought she was doing anything other than living her life. But she was very aware of, the credits and stuff, because she's a professional. She was very aware of her credit, because there's a time where she would say that her husband and her were sharing the same camera. So once you're sharing the same camera, you can't always remember who took the photographs. So to stop the arguments and him taking the credit that it was his, she'd always make sure that when she took a picture, she brought him in the frame. So you would see him. So you could never say that it was one of hers. So she's totally aware. She's a modern woman of her time, and she was just so ahead of her time. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Monica. It's been such a thrill to ask you about Homai. And please, I would recommend that you, like I said, watch the film, look up her photographs. So I think we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A. So we're going to welcome Shamil back onto the... You're allowed back now, Shamil.
Can I just say the Dawda 13, because that's such importance, because it's the name of the film. The film's called Dawda 13, and Vyarawalla was known as Dawda 13, but it wasn't a name she gave herself. It was a name the police force gave her. She didn't particularly like the name, because she doesn't like pet names. She's very kind of hard, dyed-in-the-wool. And why they gave her the name was because the license plate was Delhi 13, DLD 13. And she was such a frequent visitor in the sort of security compounds where she had to shoot photographs and that the police would recognize her car, wave her through and say, there goes Dawda. And then she got Dawda 13.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. My eyes are wide open. I have a simple question for you, Anita. When Sophia went to India, could she speak and understand Hindi?
Such a good question, and no. And the reason we know that she could not, well, first of all, she last sees her father, to all intents and purposes, when she is 9 years old. That's the first time she's arrested, when he's got this crazy idea to go and seize back India or Punjab from Queen Victoria, who he now refers to as Mrs. Fagin, the receiver of stolen goods. So then she loses her father. Her mother dies at her bedside, who isn't Indian anyway. She's a mixed race woman, half German, half Abyssinian. And she's raised almost, sort of by British foster parents, so she never learns it. It becomes painful when the suffragettes, during the First World War, when war is declared, they drop their rocks, most of them, because they get behind the war effort. And she not only gets behind fundraising, but she immediately goes to Brighton, where the Indian soldiers, who are largely from Punjab, they're the first ones sent into the trenches in France, without the right boots, without the right coats. They are shivering and hurt, and their broken bodies are coming back. And she goes and she becomes a nurse to try and look after them. And she can't speak her own language to her own people. She has to turn to white nurses who've spent time serving the Raj to translate for her. So, you know, that whole thing of identity and who you are, I mean, British Asians will understand the struggle is real, and she is one of the first who have gone through it.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was really interesting. I just had a quick question based on some of my own reflections. I studied history at university, was always interested in it at school, but never saw my own story or people that looked like me in history textbooks. And I always found myself feeling much like what you've just said. What is my identity as someone British Asian? What does that mean? And not really making sense of why I was here in the first place. And I think that translated into social media as well, and kind of Western notions of beauty, feeling out of place all the time. It wasn't until I got to university and I wrote my dissertation on my dad's story of history and how he came over to Britain from Uganda. And you only have to look at the news now and realise how impactful that journey has been on our landscape of Britain. And all of these things, and more recently, there's been a renaissance in the way we talk about history, led by people like yourselves, Satnam Sangera, and these stories coming to light that I think for me personally, and I don't know if other British Asians in the room relate, has been so emotional in some ways to think, wow, finally we're talking about these things, we're writing about these things, and in many ways, you yourselves have been trailblazers in that regard. But I wanted to ask, when you were talking about these three women and looking into their stories, did you yourselves feel an emotional arc, and how has it impacted your own view of yourself? And as three women of colour, how have you found kind of the change in your life as a result? Has that been an emotional journey for you, and do you think it's kind of changed any element of your life as well? Thank you.
I was actually saying to Anita earlier that we have this question that we write, so it's if anyone's got teenagers, it's end of year exam season at the moment, and so all of our students have to do an end of year exam, and in year 9, that's when you end your compulsory history education. So we ask our students, their last question they have to answer is, if you could have a statue of anybody that you've learnt about with us at Claremont, who do you think there should be a statue of? And I was saying to Anita that so many of the South Asian girls and boys, but also non-South Asian girls and boys, think that there should be a statue of Sophia, because we teach about her in year 9. Lots of them also talk about Noor Inayat Khan, who I get very emotional talking about when I teach the lesson about her as well. A lot of them write about Jaya Ben Desai as well, and I get very emotional when her picture's on the board, the striker in the sari. And yeah, I think, you're right that a lot, all of us when we were at school, we did not see ourselves in the curriculum. I always use the example that if South Asian women were mentioned in the curriculum, it was in the context of honour killings, and that was about it. If there was a mention of a South Asian man, it was Gandhi and Gandhi only. So we've really come a long way, and absolutely, I think that every time that I teach about particularly South Asian women in the classroom, it is an emotional experience, because these women, and a question that I posed to Monika when we had our chat was, what would Homai make of being one of these trailblazers?
I think she would have enjoyed it so much, because in terms of the end of her life, I see her life in 3 stages. I'm sort of in the middle, and when she got recognized yet again, another renaissance, she got invited to America. She's always wanted to go there. Because although she was having America come to India, and she was seeing the Kennedys and Danny Kaye, and there's a lovely picture with the deaf and blind woman, Helen Keller, with Homai meeting Helen Keller, and so she was very wanting to see the rest of the world. She wanted to come to England as well because of the empire and being part of that. So when she got a chance to do it in her 90s, the end of her life, she was so blown, and she was just standing in Trafalgar Square, thinking, I'm here. So I think she would have loved this.
Just very briefly, the emotion, I'll just answer the one bit of it, my emotional journey. You are my emotional journey. When I first started writing this book, I really only wrote it for me. I only wrote it because I couldn't get this story out of my head, and I wanted to make sense of it, and I'm one of those people, like, you know, a dog with a flea. I can't stop scratching it until I get it out. And since I wrote it, the number of times that young women come and say, finally I see me in history, it's everything and everything. So thank you. Just thank you for reading it and caring about it.
I've got a couple of observations. One is that it's incredible to have living history here. So Monika has met Homai, and Homai died, I think, only in 2012, something like that, which is remarkable to me that we're sort of in touch with this history that we're talking about. And Homai would have been a clear contemporary of Sophia, the Duleep Singh, who only died, what, in 48, or just after the war. And of course, the Rani Lakshmi Bai, there's plenty of links in history in 1857. So we're seeing this span of history. And something else that ringing in my ears a little bit is Awaz Do, which is not just about give me a voice today, but Homai didn't have a voice until someone like Monika gave her one, and she's here today, and we're only doing this because people have given her a voice. And maybe similarly for Sophia as well, who wrote that short thing, or wanted that short thing in the epigram, that there's so much more to say, and Anita has given that to voice. And similarly for Shalina, who's giving voice to people in history who need a voice. So I think Awaz Do is that as well, giving a voice to women in history who weren't that talkative about what they did. And maybe the innate modesty of women prevented that at the time. And you know, men were happy to talk about what we do. But honestly, just a massive privilege to have these three amazing ladies talking about what they've talked about today. I just want to end with a massive vote of thanks to everyone involved in putting the event together, but also for Monika, to Anita, and to Shalina for giving voice, giving Awaz to these ladies of history who are incredibly important. So I'm humbled to be here. I said that in all sincerity. I'm really thrilled that we do this event, or be part of this event. And a huge round of applause for our three ladies here.